You think you chose them. That's the first lie. You think the moment you fell, that specific, electric, unforgettable moment, was spontaneous, organic, real. You remember exactly where you were, what they said, how they looked at you like you were the only person in the room. You tell yourself, this is different, this is genuine, this is chemistry. But what if I told you that chemistry has a recipe? What if the look, the timing, the silence before the compliment, the way they made you feel seen for the first time in years, what if all of it followed a pattern, a sequence? A psychological architecture designed, consciously or not, to make you feel exactly what you felt. This book is not about making you paranoid, it's about making you awake. Because here's what no one tells you. Desire is not something that happens to you. Desire is something that is built, layer by layer, moment by moment, inside the theater of your own mind. And most people are both the audience and the stage without ever knowing it. Seduction is one of the oldest forces in human civilization. It has toppled empires, ended wars, launched them. It has driven people to abandon families, fortunes, faiths, and feel righteous doing it. And yet we treat it like a mystery, like magic, like something too sacred or too shameful to examine in the light. That stops here. What you're about to read will feel uncomfortable at times. You'll recognize patterns in your own past. Moments where you were the one being engineered, or moments where you engineered without knowing it. You'll question relationships, memories, your own sense of agency. Good, that discomfort is the first sign that something real is happening. But here's the question I need you to sit with before you turn the page. The one that will haunt this entire book. If you could see exactly how your desire was constructed, would you still want what you want? Don't answer yet. You don't have enough information. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The spell you never noticed being cast. You didn't fall in love, you were led there. And the most disturbing part, the part that will sit with you long after you finish this chapter, is that some part of you already suspects this. Some quiet, rational corner of your mind has always known that the feeling wasn't entirely your own, that the timing was too perfect, that the pull was too strong to be accidental. But you dismissed that voice, didn't you? Because the alternative was too uncomfortable to entertain. So, the alternative was this. You are not as in control of your desires as you believe. Let's begin there. There is a version of you that exists in your own imagination. Steady, perceptive, emotionally intelligent. This version of you would never be manipulated, would never be blinded by attraction, would never mistake performance for authenticity or intensity for depth. You've watched other people fall apart over someone clearly wrong for them and thought, quietly, perhaps a little smugly, I would never let that happen to me. That thought, that specific thought, that is the vulnerability. Not weakness, not stupidity, not naivety. The vulnerability is the certainty itself. Because the brain doesn't protect what it believes is already safe. And the moment you decide you are immune to something, you stop watching for it. You lower the gate. You leave the door not just unlocked but open, and you call it confidence. This is not an insult. This is neuroscience. The human brain was not designed for the modern emotional landscape. It was designed for survival, fast, instinctive, pattern-hungry. And one of its oldest, deepest patterns is this: seek connection, reduce threat, move toward warmth. These are not choices. These are directives. They run beneath thought, beneath language, beneath everything you believe makes you you. And they can be triggered, reliably, repeatedly, by someone who understands how. Think about the last time you felt that pull. That specific, electric, impossible to explain draw toward another person. Try to locate the moment it began. You probably can't, not precisely, because it didn't begin in a single moment. It began in a sequence. A look held a half-second longer than necessary. A laugh at exactly the right time. A question that made you feel more interesting than you'd felt in months. A silence that somehow said more than words. None of those things feel like architecture. They feel like chemistry. That's the genius of it. Here is what the research tells us, and what almost no one wants to hear. Attraction is not a feeling that arrives. It is a feeling that is constructed, layer by layer, stimulus by stimulus. The brain is not experiencing something real and then labeling it desire. The brain is receiving a sequence of signals, pattern matching them against its deepest emotional templates. It's childhood experiences of being seen, of being wanted, of being safe, and then generating a feeling it calls desire. You are not falling for a person, not at first. You are falling for a signal, and signals can be engineered. This does not mean every attraction is false. It does not mean every relationship is a manipulation. What it means is far more unsettling. Genuine connection and manufactured desire feel identical from the inside. The brain cannot tell the difference. And because it cannot tell the difference, neither can you, not without tools you were never given. Think about someone from your past, someone you burned for, someone who made you reckless in ways you still don't entirely understand. Now ask yourself honestly, was it them? Was it genuinely specifically them? Their soul, their essence, their irreplaceable selfhood that set you on fire? Or was it the way they made you feel about yourself, the way they looked at you, the way they leaned in when you talked, as though your words were worth leaning toward, the way they seemed somehow to see the version of you that you most wanted to be and reflected it back? Because that's the move. That has always been the move. And it works not because it is deceptive, but because it targets something true. The hunger to be seen, the need to be chosen, the profound, aching human desire to have someone look at you as though you are the answer to a question they've been asking their whole life. That hunger is not a weakness, but it is a door, and some people know exactly how to walk through it. You are reading this, and one of two things is happening inside you right now. Either you are thinking about someone who did this to you, and something cold and clarifying is settling into your chest as the pattern becomes visible for the first time. Or you are thinking about someone you may have done this to, not deliberately, perhaps not consciously, but effectively. The look you held, the distance you created at exactly the right moment, the way you became suddenly less available just when they started wanting you more. Both realizations are valid, both are important, and both point to the same truth. This dynamic is not exceptional. It is not the territory of manipulators and monsters. It is the operating system of human desire, running in everyone, all the time. The question is not whether it is happening. The question is whether you are awake enough to see it. And here is where it deepens, because understanding is not the same as immunity. Knowing that a magic trick uses mirrors does not make the image disappear. The brain still processes the illusion, still generates the response. Knowing that desire can be engineered does not make you suddenly cold to its engineering. You will still feel the pull. You will still lean toward the warmth. You will still, in certain moments, with certain people, feel that electricity and want nothing more than to believe it is fate. The difference, the only difference, is what you do in the space between the feeling and the decision. Whether you follow the pull blindly, or whether you pause. Whether you ask the question most people never think to ask, who built this feeling and why? That question is not paranoia. That question is power. But there is something else. Something this chapter has been circling without naming directly. Something that makes this entire conversation more complicated and more necessary than it might first appear. It is not only other people who engineer your desire. You have been engineering your own. The stories you tell yourself about who you are attracted to and why. The patterns you repeat across different faces and different years. The particular type of person who catches your attention in a room full of people, and the very specific thing about them that catches it. These are not accidents. These are not fate. These are instructions written into you long before you were old enough to question them. You arrived at desire with a blueprint already in hand, built from early experiences of love and absence, warmth and withdrawal, being chosen and being overlooked. And you have been ever since, unconsciously seeking out the people and situations that match that blueprint, because familiarity, even painful familiarity, registers in the brain as safety. You have been following a map you didn't draw and cannot fully read, and the map has been leading you somewhere. Whether that somewhere is where you actually want to go. That is the question this book exists to answer. The spell was cast before they ever walked into the room. It was cast in you long ago, by forces you didn't choose, in moments you barely remember, through experiences that shaped the architecture of your wanting without your consent. They just knew how to read it. Chapter 2. Desire is a story your brain tells itself. You have never desired a person, not once, not ever. You have desired the story you constructed about them. In the space between their words, in the silence after their laugh, in the milliseconds your brain spent filling the gaps between who they actually are and who you needed them to be, the person you fell for, that person largely lived inside your own mind. And the tragedy, the part that cuts deepest when you're finally ready to look at it, is that the story was often more vivid, more real, more emotionally consuming than any human being could ever actually be. This is not cynicism. This is the architecture of the human mind laid bare. The brain is a meaning-making machine. It cannot tolerate incompleteness. Handed a fragment, a half smile, a vague text, an unexplained distance, and it will work urgently and involuntarily to construct a whole. It will generate explanations, motivations, entire emotional landscapes to account for the fragment. And the explanations it generates are not random. They are shaped by everything you carry. Your history, your hunger, your oldest and most unexamined beliefs about what love looks like and what you deserve. This is why the most intoxicating people in your life were often the least legible ones. Not because mystery is romantic, though the brain will tell you that too, but because mystery is an invitation, a blank space, and a blank space is a canvas. And a canvas is an opportunity for the most powerful creative force you possess, your imagination, to do what it does best. It builds, and what it builds feels more real than reality. Think about the early days, you know the ones. Before the relationship solidified into something knowable, something daily and defined, when they were still uncertain, when every interaction carried weight, when a single message could shift your entire emotional landscape, when you analyzed the angle of a glance for hidden meaning. What were you actually doing during those hours of analysis? You were writing. You were authoring in real time, a story with them as the protagonist, a story in which they were endlessly complex, endlessly fascinating, full of depths you had barely begun to explore. Every ambiguity became evidence of richness. Every inconsistency became proof of layers. Every moment of distance became a narrative beat, the part where the connection is tested before it deepens. You were not falling for them. You were falling for your own storytelling. And your brain, flooded with dopamine not from them but from the anticipation of them, from the uncertainty itself, told you this feeling was special, unique, unrepeatable. It was. Just not in the way you thought. Here is what cognitive science has documented, and what poets have intuited for centuries without the clinical language to match. The brain does not distinguish cleanly between what is real and what is vividly imagined. The neural pathways activated when you think intensely about a person overlap dramatically with those activated when you are actually with them. Which means the longing you felt at 3 a.m, staring at your phone, constructing elaborate interpretations of a 2-word response. That longing was neurologically almost indistinguishable from presence. You were with them, in the only place that matters to the brain, inside it. And the version of them that lived inside you, that version never contradicted you, never disappointed you in the small, grinding ways real people inevitably do. Never had bad timing, or a bad day, or a moment of profound ordinariness. That version existed in a perpetual state of potential, always about to reveal the next layer, always on the edge of becoming everything you needed. That version, when something is readily available, the brain categorizes it as low value. This is not a choice. It is a survival heuristic, wired into the oldest architecture of your nervous system. What is abundant is safe to ignore. What is rare demands attention. Apply that to human beings, to their time, their affection, their presence, and you get something devastating. The person who is always available, always warm, always certain of their feelings for you. The brain de-escalates them, files them. Stops generating stories about them because there are no gaps to fill, no fragments to interpret, no uncertainty to resolve. The narrative flatlines. And without narrative, the brain calls what remains something far less interesting than desire. It calls it comfort, and it treats comfort like a problem to be solved. Meanwhile, the one who keeps you uncertain, the one whose warmth arrives unpredictably, whose attention feels like weather, present one moment and gone the next. That person becomes a story that never resolves. And unresolved stories are the ones you cannot put down. You have experienced this. You know the specific hunger of waiting for someone who keeps you waiting, the way it sharpens everything. Makes you more alert, more aware, more alive in a way that feels like passion, but is actually closer to anxiety with good lighting. The brain does not care about your well-being in these moments. It cares about closing the loop. It will tell you that the intensity you feel is proof of depth, proof of connection, proof that this one is different. It is a convincing narrator. It has had a great deal of practice, and it has told you this story before, just with different names attached to the same ache. There is a moment, maybe you've had it, when you finally saw someone clearly, not with love, not with longing, but with an almost startling neutrality. And in that moment, you looked at the person you had spent months or years constructing an entire interior world around. And you thought, who is this actually? Not with cruelty, with genuine confusion, because the story had collapsed. And without the story, the person standing there was just a person. Complicated in ordinary ways, inconsistent in unremarkable ways. No more or less extraordinary than any other collection of habits and histories walking around in human form. And you felt something strange in that moment. Something that might have been lost, but wasn't lost for them. It was lost for the story, for the version of them that had existed so fully and so vividly in your mind that their absence left an actual space. You grieved a fiction. And the grief was entirely real. This is the part most people cannot sit with, the implication that follows. If desire is a story, and if you are the author of that story, then every time you have burned for someone, every time you have sacrificed and ached and rearranged yourself around another person's presence, some significant portion of that experience was generated by you, not by them. By the narrative machinery of your own mind, working at full capacity, in the dark without your supervision, which raises a question so uncomfortable that most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. What does it mean to love a real person? Not the story, not the projection, not the beautifully unresolved novel your brain has been writing, but the actual, specific, contradictory, occasionally boring human being in front of you? What does that even look like? And the darker question beneath that one, the one this chapter has been building towards since its first sentence. Have you ever actually done it? The story your brain tells about desire is the most immersive narrative you will ever encounter. It is told in the language of emotion, and it is illustrated by memory, and it is scored by every song that has ever made you feel something you couldn't name. It is extraordinarily convincing. It is sometimes extraordinarily beautiful, and it is at its core a construction, not a lie. Stories are not lies, but a story is not the same as the truth. And living inside a story, no matter how beautiful, is not the same as living in reality. The next chapter will show you what happens when the story is written deliberately. When someone else picks up the pen. When the narrative you thought was yours was being authored, from the beginning, by hands you never saw. That is a different kind of unsettling. Prepare yourself. Chapter 3. The Mirror Trap. Why we want what reflects us back. The most powerful seductive force in existence has no name in common language. It leaves no fingerprints. It requires no charm, no beauty, no extraordinary wit or wealth. It works in silence, in the architecture of a conversation, in the way someone tilts their head when you speak. And it is so deeply embedded in human psychology that most people will defend it, warmly and completely, as connection. It is not connection. Or rather, it is something that mimics connection so precisely that the brain cannot tell the difference. And you have fallen for it, more than once. With more intensity than you have probably been willing to admit. There is something intoxicating about being understood. Not the ordinary, surface-level understanding of shared interests or compatible schedules, but the deeper, rarer sensation of being seen, forwarded across from another person and feeling, with sudden and overwhelming clarity, that they get it, that they get you, the way you think, the way you feel, the specific, strange, private architecture of your interior world that you have spent most of your life either hiding or offering carefully, in small pieces, to people who handled it imperfectly. When someone finally seems to hold that interior world with both hands, carefully, reverently, as though it is valuable, the relief is almost physical. That relief is the trap. Here is what you were not told. The feeling of being understood and the experience of being mirrored are neurologically indistinguishable. Mirroring in its psychological form, is the act of reflecting someone's values, language, emotional tone, and self-concept back at them with enough precision that they experience it as resonance, as recognition, as the rare and precious sensation of finally, someone like me. It is not always conscious. Many people do it instinctively, a social reflex honed over years of navigating human dynamics without ever naming what they were doing. But whether it is deliberate or instinctive, the effect on the person being mirrored is identical. They feel found. And feeling found, when you have spent any significant portion of your life feeling lost or unseen or fundamentally misunderstood, is one of the most powerful emotional experiences available to a human being. The brain does not respond to it with caution. The brain responds to it with opening, with warmth, with a dismantling of the careful, considered defenses that experience has taught you to maintain. You don't lower your guard because you decided to. You lower it because every signal in your nervous system is telling you, this is safe, this is rare, do not let this go. Think about the relationships in your past that began with that electric sensation of being understood. The conversations that ran for hours without effort, where you kept thinking, yes, exactly, that's exactly it. Where the other person seemed to finish your thoughts, or voice your feelings before you had found the words for them, or describe their own experience in language so close to your own that it felt like looking into still water. Now ask yourself, how much of who they presented themselves to be in those early weeks was consistent with who they turned out to be? Take your time, because here is the pattern that most people only see in retrospect, if they see it at all. The mirroring is densest at the beginning. It is richest and most precise in the early stage, when you are still being studied, still being read, when the other person, consciously or not, is calibrating their presentation to match the image you most need to see reflected. They are listening, not just to what you say, but to what your words reveal about your values, your wounds, your self-concept. They are building in real time a portrait of your ideal version of resonance, and then performing it back to you with startling accuracy. And you, receiving that performance as genuine understanding, open further, share more, reveal the deeper levels. And with each new revelation, the mirror adjusts, sharpens, becomes more precise. The more you give, the more perfectly they reflect. And the more perfectly they reflect, the more certain you become that this person is singular, irreplaceable, that what you have found is rare enough to be worth almost anything. The terrible irony. The thing that makes this particular dynamic so difficult to name and nearly impossible to resist is that the need it exploits is entirely legitimate. You do need to be understood. You do need to be seen. The hunger for genuine recognition is not a weakness or a failure of self-sufficiency. It is one of the most fundamental human requirements, as real and as serious as hunger for food or shelter. Loneliness, the specific kind that comes from existing inside an interior world that no one ever fully enters, is not a minor discomfort. It is one of the most corrosive experiences available to a conscious being. So when something arrives that appears to answer that hunger, the brain does not question it. The brain does not ask, is this real or is this a reflection? It simply experiences the relief, the warmth, the extraordinary life-altering sensation of no longer being alone inside yourself. And then it begins to attach. There is a particular quality to the attachment that forms under mirroring, and it is different from the attachment that grows through genuine mutual knowing. It is faster, it is more intense. It has a quality of certainty that ordinary connection rarely carries so early. A sense of I have been waiting for this without knowing I was waiting. This certainty feels like evidence, like proof of something real and rare and worth protecting. It is not evidence. It is the neurological signature of a need being met. And needs, when met after long absence, produce responses that feel indistinguishable from profound emotional truth. This is how people end up certain, absolutely unshakably certain, that someone they have known for 3 weeks is the most important person they have ever encountered. The mirror was working perfectly. Now comes the part that is harder to receive. You have been the one being mirrored, but you have also, almost certainly, been the mirror. Not necessarily with calculation, not necessarily with any conscious intent to deceive. But think about the early days of relationships you wanted, the ones where you felt the pull of desire shaping your behavior in real time. Think about how carefully you listened, how attentively you noted what they responded to and adjusted your presentation accordingly, how you emphasized certain aspects of yourself, the parts that seemed to resonate, and quietly set aside others that might create friction or distance. You were not lying. You were performing the most appealing version of yourself, but the person they were falling for, that precise, luminous, perfectly resonant person, how complete a picture was that, really? How much of what they believed they understood about you was what you chose to reflect, rather than the fuller, more complicated, less strategically curated truth? Sit with that question. It deserves more than a quick answer. There is a darker layer beneath this, and it is the one that transforms this dynamic from a psychological curiosity into something with real stakes. When a relationship is built primarily on mirroring, when the foundation is not two people meeting in their actual complexity, but rather one person's idealized self-image being reflected back with extraordinary precision, there will come a moment when the mirror cracks, when the real person behind it becomes visible. When they have a bad day, or a contradictory opinion, or a need that conflicts with yours, or simply a moment of ordinary human limitation that the mirror could not have predicted. And in that moment, something strange happens in the person who was being mirrored. Instead of adjusting their understanding, instead of thinking, here is more of who this person actually is, they feel often viscerally that something has been taken from them, that the connection has been somehow damaged, that the other person has changed, or withdrawn, or become less than they were. The other person hasn't changed. The mirror simply slipped. But the feeling of loss is real. And it drives people back, urgently, sometimes desperately, toward the version they first experienced. They work to recreate the conditions of the early mirroring. They give more, reveal more, try harder to be the person the mirror responded to, without ever understanding that they are not trying to reach another human being. They are trying to find their own reflection. The most seductive thing in the world is not beauty, or wit, or power. It is the sensation of being fully, finally seen, and the most devastating discovery you can make. The one this chapter has been walking you towards since its opening line is that seen and reflected are not the same thing. That the face looking back at you from still water is not another face, it is your own. And falling in love with it, no matter how real the feeling, is a closed loop. A mirror cannot love you back. It can only show you what you brought to it. Chapter 4. The 7 Levers. Psychological triggers that manufacture attraction. Someone is using these on you right now. Not metaphorically, not theoretically. Right now, in your actual life. In a relationship or a dynamic, or a slow burning, almost. Something that you cannot stop thinking about. The mechanisms this chapter is about to name are actively shaping what you feel, what you want, and what you are willing to do to get it. You did not consent to this. You were not informed. And the most unsettling part is not that it is happening. It is that, until this moment, it was working perfectly. There is a comfortable story most people tell themselves about attraction. That it is felt, not manufactured. That desire rises organically from some genuine meeting of two people. Their chemistry, their compatibility, their timing. That when you feel it, really feel it, the feeling itself is proof of something real beneath it. This chapter is not going to be gentle with that story, because what you call chemistry has components. What you call timing has mechanics. What you experience as the ineffable, unquantifiable electricity of desire is, at its core, the result of specific psychological conditions being met in a specific sequence. Remove any one of the components. Disrupt the sequence. And the electricity, the feeling you would have sworn was fated, irreplaceable, uniquely yours, simply does not appear. Desire is not magic. Desire is engineering, and there are 7 levers that run it. The first is mystery. Not the romantic idea of mystery. Not exotic or complicated, or hard to read in the ways that make people seem interesting. A simpler, more mechanical version. The withholding of information that the brain urgently wants to complete. The human mind cannot tolerate an open pattern. Present it with an incomplete picture of a person and it will work, compulsively, involuntarily, around the clock to fill in the gaps. This work feels like fascination. It presents itself as there is something extraordinary here that I have not yet fully understood. But what is actually happening is simpler and less flattering. The brain is trying to close a loop that will not close, and the effort of trying has been labeled incorrectly as depth of feeling. The person who reveals everything immediately rarely seems as compelling as the one who reveals just enough to make you want more. Not because the latter has more to offer, because the brain is more engaged in the act of pursuing than the act of possessing. Mystery does not create desire. Mystery creates pursuit. And pursuit, the brain cannot distinguish from desire. The second lever is scarcity. And you already know this one. You have felt it acutely, in the specific register of wanting someone more the moment they became less available. The brain applies a valuation system to human attention that operates on the same logic as economic scarcity. What is abundant is low value. What is rare is worth acquiring. This is not a choice. It is a neurological reflex, older than language, older than civilization, older than any conscious belief you hold about how relationships should work. Someone who is always available, always present, always certain of their feelings for you, triggers nothing in this system. The system is not engaged. There is no scarcity signal, no urgency, no escalating sense that this must be pursued before it disappears. Warmth without scarcity is processed, eventually, as background, as given, as safe enough to stop attending to. But introduce even the faintest possibility of loss, a delayed response, a sudden vagueness, a moment of attention redirected elsewhere, and the system fires immediately. The brain reorients, prioritizes, begins generating the specific, restless, forward-leaning energy that feels from the inside exactly like passion. It is not passion. It is a threat response wearing passion's clothes. The third lever is validation withdrawal. This one is precise and it is devastating, and it works on people who would be horrified to learn how completely it works on them. People who are confident, self-aware, emotionally intelligent in most areas of their life. Consistent validation feels good. It does not create desire. What creates desire? What escalates a dynamic from pleasant to consuming is the interruption of consistent validation, the warmth that becomes unpredictable, the approval that was freely given and then, without explanation, becomes something you have to earn. The shift from being chosen to being evaluated. This shift does something specific in the brain. It activates the same neural pathways as a variable reward schedule, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive, that makes social media compulsive. The unpredictability itself becomes the drug, not the reward. The possibility of the reward, arriving on an irregular schedule that the brain cannot predict or control. People in the grip of this lever will often work extraordinarily hard to return to the warmth they experienced before it was withdrawn. They will try harder, offer more, become more attuned to the other person's moods and needs, reduce their own demands to minimize friction. They will experience this escalating effort not as loss of self, but as evidence of how much they care. The caring is real. The cause of it has been manufactured. The fourth lever is idealization. And this one you largely do to yourself, though it is easily catalyzed from outside. Idealization is the process by which the brain elevates a person from human to symbol, from a specific, complex, limited individual into a representation of something much larger. Safety, freedom, home, the version of yourself you most want to become. The love you did not receive when receiving it would have shaped you differently. The idealized person does not have to be extraordinary. They have to arrive at the right moment, in the right emotional context, and activate the right internal associations, and the brain will do the rest. We'll fill the ordinary with significance. We'll read depth into surface. We'll find in this particular person the answer to questions that have nothing to do with them, and everything to do with the narrative you have been carrying unresolved for years. When idealization is consciously activated, when someone studies what you are searching for and positions themselves as its answer, the effect is not just attraction. It is a kind of devotion that will survive contradictory evidence for a remarkable length of time, because the brain is not evaluating them as a person. It is protecting them as a symbol. The fifth lever is manufactured intimacy. Intimacy, real intimacy, develops slowly. It is built through accumulated time, through witnessed failure and continued presence, through the gradual and often unglamorous process of being known in your ordinary, unperforming moments. This takes months, sometimes years. Manufactured intimacy compresses this timeline. It uses specific techniques, deep questions asked early, strategic self-disclosure, the creation of shared secrets and private languages and references that exist only between two people, to generate in hours or days the feeling of intimacy that would normally require a much longer and more honest process to develop. This feeling is real, the neural experience of it is genuine, but the foundation beneath it is made of paper, not stone. This is why some of the most intense early connections collapse so completely when reality arrives. Not because the people were wrong for each other, though sometimes they were, but because the intimacy was a feeling generated by technique, and techniques, unlike real knowledge of a person, do not hold weight. The sixth lever is contrast. The brain does not evaluate people in absolute terms. It evaluates them relative to context. The same warmth that would barely register in a field of warmth becomes extraordinary in a landscape of cold. The same attention that would be ordinary becomes remarkable against a background of neglect. The same person who might seem average in one emotional context becomes compelling, even magnetic in another. This is why people who initially create distance, who are slightly withholding, slightly cool, who make you feel subtly uncertain of your standing, can produce such a disproportionate response when they turn warm. The warmth is not being evaluated against an absolute standard. It is being evaluated against the cold that preceded it. And the contrast inflates its value far beyond what the warmth itself would generate if offered freely from the beginning. Create contrast deliberately. Cool to warm, distant to present, ambivalent to intensely interested. And you do not merely generate attraction. You generate something closer to overwhelming relief, which the grateful nervous system will classify, gratefully and incorrectly, as love. Seventh lever is pacing, and it is perhaps the most sophisticated of all, because it requires not just understanding the other person's psychology, but reading, in real time, the current state of their desire, and calibrating disclosure, intensity, and availability to remain always slightly ahead of satiation. Move too fast and the gap closes before the brain has generated sufficient investment. Move too slow and the signal dies before it ignites. The precise management of pace, of when to advance and when to retreat, when to reveal and when to withhold, when to increase intensity and when to suddenly, inexplicably cool, is what separates a dynamic that fades after weeks from one that consumes years. Masterful pacing feels, to the person experiencing it, like the relationship is simply unfolding naturally, organically, at exactly the rate that feels right without ever being discussed or decided. This feeling of natural unfolding is itself the product of the pacing. The naturalness is performed. The rightness is engineered. 7 levers, 7 mechanisms, running constantly in combination beneath the surface of every dynamic you have ever called chemistry. Now here is what this knowledge demands of you. The question you cannot unknow once you have sat with it fully. When you look at the relationships that have shaped you most profoundly, the ones that left marks you still carry, how many of these levers were active? How many were being pulled, consciously or not, by someone who understood, at some level, exactly what they were doing? And how many, you must also ask, were being pulled by you? Because the levers do not require malice to operate. They do not require consciousness. They run on instinct, on social reflex, on the accumulated behavioral learning of a person who has spent years navigating desire without a map. Most people are operating these mechanisms without knowing their names, without understanding their effects, without any awareness that what they are generating in another person is not chemistry, but a response to a set of conditions they have created. You are not innocent of this. Neither is anyone you have ever wanted. The question that remains, the one this chapter cannot answer for you, only point toward, is what you choose to do with this knowledge. Whether it becomes a weapon, a wound, or a window into something that might finally be more honest than anything the levers have ever built. Understanding the machine does not obligate you to keep running it, but you have to see it first. Chapter 5, The Withdrawal Cycle. Why inconsistency is more addictive than love. The person who has hurt you the most is probably also the one you have wanted the most. Sit with that. Don't rush past it. Because buried inside that statement is the central paradox of human desire. The one that has quietly shaped more of your choices, more of your suffering, more of the relationships that have left the deepest marks on your life than almost any other force you have encountered. You already know this is true. You have lived it. What you have not had until now is the language to understand why. Why does the person who shows up consistently, who loves you without conditions, who is warm and present and certain, why does that person so often fail to generate the electricity that the other one does? The one who keeps you waiting, the one whose moods arrive like weather, the one who makes you feel chosen, and then without warning or apparent reason, makes you feel invisible, and then chosen again, and then invisible again, in a rhythm that you cannot predict, and therefore cannot prepare for, and therefore cannot stop thinking about. This is not a preference. This is a pattern. And patterns have causes. You probably believe on some level that your capacity for deep feeling is a strength, that the intensity with which you have loved, the sleepless nights, the obsessive analysis, the willingness to rearrange your life around another person's presence is evidence of your emotional depth, of how fully you are capable of connecting. What if it is evidence of something else entirely? What if the intensity you have experienced in your most consuming relationships was not generated by the quality of the connection, but by the structure of the uncertainty? What if the fire you felt was not about the person at all, but about the specific, excruciating, neurologically irresistible experience of not knowing whether you were going to get what you needed, and wanting it anyway, and sometimes getting it, and that sometimes being enough to keep you in the game indefinitely? What if your deepest love stories were not love stories at all, but the most elaborate addiction you have ever had? In the 1950s, a behavioral psychologist named B.F. Skinner placed pigeons in boxes and gave them levers to press. In one condition, pressing the lever always produced a food pellet. In another, pressing the lever produced a pellet randomly. Sometimes after one press, sometimes after 20, sometimes after 200. On a schedule the pigeon could never predict or decode. The pigeons in the first condition pressed the lever when they were hungry and stopped when they were full. The pigeons in the second condition pressed the lever compulsively, obsessively, long past the point of hunger, long past any rational relationship between effort and reward. They pressed it when they were exhausted. They pressed it in ways that looked, from the outside, less like hunger and more like desperation. The variable reward schedule, the maybe, was more powerful than the certainty, not slightly more powerful, categorically, overwhelmingly more powerful. And the behavior it produced looked less like satisfaction, seeking, and more like what we would now recognize, without hesitation, as addiction. You are not a pigeon, but you are running on the same hardware. The neurochemistry of intermittent reinforcement in human relationships follows the same architecture. When affection, attention, or approval arrives on an unpredictable schedule, sometimes immediately, sometimes after a long and agonizing wait, sometimes not at all, the brain does not respond by reducing investment. It responds by increasing it, by orienting more completely toward the source of the unpredictable reward, by allocating more cognitive and emotional resources to monitoring, analyzing, and attempting to influence the conditions under which the reward appears. This is why you checked your phone, not once, obsessively in a loop, aware that you were doing it and unable to stop. This is why a single warm message after 3 days of silence could reverse hours of pain in an instant, and why that reversal felt less like relief and more like a high. This is why you stayed, not because the relationship was good, not because the evidence supported staying, but because the brain, deep in the grip of a variable reward cycle, has one overriding directive: do not stop now. The reward might come on the next press. And sometimes it did, just often enough. Here is the part that is hardest to receive without resistance. The person who generated this dynamic in you may not have done it deliberately. Inconsistency does not require strategy. It only requires a person who is themselves unresolved, emotionally unavailable in ways they have not examined, carrying their own cycles of approach and withdrawal that have nothing to do with you, and everything to do with what they learned love looks like when they were young enough to absorb it as truth. They are not necessarily calculating the withdrawal. They are simply moving according to their own internal weather system. Warm when they feel safe, cold when they feel threatened, present when the vulnerability feels manageable and absent when it doesn't. Their inconsistency is not a plan, but its effect on you is identical to if it were. Because the brain does not care about intention. The brain cares about pattern. And the pattern, warm, cold, present, absent, chosen, invisible, chosen again, is the pattern that generates the cycle, regardless of why it exists. Regardless of whether the person on the other end is aware of what they are creating. The fire is real. The addiction is real. The suffering is real. The cause of all three is a schedule of reinforcement that your nervous system was never designed to resist. Now go back. Go back to the relationship that comes to mind when you read this chapter, and you know exactly which one it is, because there is always one. The one that left the deepest mark. The one you still think about longer than makes rational sense. The one that other relationships are quietly measured against, usually to their detriment. Map the cycle, trace it honestly. There were periods of extraordinary warmth, moments where you felt more seen, more wanted, more fully alive in their presence than you had felt in years. Those moments were real. The feeling in them was real. Hold on to that, because it matters that the warmth was genuine. It is not a simple story. But what followed the warmth? A cooling, a distance, something unnamed and unexplained that created in you a specific restless anxiety. The sense that something had shifted, that you had somehow lost the connection you had been basking in, that if you could just figure out what had changed, you could change it back. And so you reached. You adjusted. You offered more, asked for less, made yourself smaller or more entertaining or more available or more understanding. Trying, through sheer effort and attunement, to return to the warmth. Sometimes it worked. And when it worked, when the warmth returned, the relief was so profound that it registered as joy, as connection, as evidence that this relationship was worth everything it had cost. But here is the question you did not ask at the time. Would that return to warmth have felt so overwhelming if the cold had not preceded it? Would the warmth have felt so precious if it had simply been continuous? The cold created the value of the warmth. The withdrawal manufactured the intensity of the return. You were not experiencing love at its most powerful. You were experiencing a cycle at its most effective. There is a specific and deeply uncomfortable realization that arrives for some people reading this chapter. Not about a past relationship, about a current one. The one they are in right now, the one they have told themselves is complicated, or requires patience, or is going through a phase, or would be different if circumstances were different, or is worth the difficulty because of how it feels in the good moments. The one their friends have gently, carefully, sometimes desperately tried to name as something other than love. If that realization is arriving for you right now, do not push it away. It is the most important thing in this chapter, and it is not the chapter that put it there. It has been there for a long time. This chapter only made it visible. The deepest truth of the withdrawal cycle is this. It does not feel like addiction from the inside. It feels like love. It feels like the specific, particular, irreplaceable quality of this connection. The texture of it, the electricity, the way this person alone produces in you a feeling that no safer, steadier relationship has ever matched. That feeling is real, but the feeling is being generated by chemistry, by a nervous system under the stress of unpredictability, by the neurological cocktail of cortisol and dopamine and oxytocin that the brain produces when it is simultaneously bonded and threatened and uncertain and hopeful all at once. What you have called your deepest love may be your most sophisticated withdrawal response, and the person who loves you quietly, consistently, without the drama and the disappearing and the hot and cold rhythm that your nervous system has learned to read as passion. That person may feel, in comparison, like not enough. They are not enough. Your nervous system is calibrated to the wrong signal. That calibration did not happen by accident. It was taught. Long before the person you are thinking of ever entered the picture. Long before you were old enough to question whether what you were being taught about love was actually true. That is the chapter that comes next, and it will require you to go somewhere you have probably been avoiding, the wound that made the cycle feel like home. Chapter 6. Personas, Masks, and the Seductive Self, the identity you perform without knowing it. The person they fell in love with was real. It was also, in significant and largely unexamined ways, a performance. And the most disorienting part of that truth is not that the performance existed. It is that you were not entirely aware you were giving it. You were not standing in the wings, rehearsing lines, calculating effect. You were simply being. Moving through those early weeks with a quality of aliveness and attentiveness, and carefully managed revelation that felt, from inside it, like authenticity. Like finally, with this person, you were showing up as your truest self. But which self exactly? The one who never lost their patience. The one who always had something interesting to say. The one whose past was presented in the most narratively coherent, emotionally flattering version you had ever assembled. The one who wanted what they wanted, liked what they liked, found fascinating what they found fascinating, in ways that were genuine, yes, but also, and this is the part that deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives, curated. The self that showed up for them was true. It was also edited. And the question of what was cut from the edit and why is one of the most revealing questions you will ever sit with about your own psychology. Every human being contains multitudes. This is not poetry. This is a structural description of how the self actually operates, not as a single, coherent, consistent entity, but as a repertoire of selves that activate differently depending on context, company, and stakes. The version of you that exists in professional settings is a self. The version with old friends is a self. The version with family, particularly the family that shaped you, is a self that often bears almost no resemblance to any other version, one that can surface without warning and with a completeness that feels, sometimes, like possession. None of these versions is more real than the others. They are all you. The question is simply which one you choose to lead with, and which ones you keep carefully off stage when someone you desire is watching. In the presence of desire, the editing process accelerates, becomes more selective, more deliberate, even when it does not feel deliberate. Because desire raises the stakes in a specific and primal way, the possibility of being fully seen by someone you want, and found wanting, activates a fear so old and so deep that most people cannot even name it directly. It is not the fear of rejection, exactly. It is the fear beneath rejection. The fear that if this person saw all of you, the unedited, unpolished, unperforming totality of who you actually are in your least managed moments, they would leave. And so you give them the best version, the most interesting, most emotionally available, most compatible version. Not because you are deceiving them, because you are protecting something. And the thing you are protecting is the possibility of being loved. There is a specific quality that shows up in people in the early stage of a desired relationship that has no precise name, but is immediately recognizable when described. A kind of heightened presence. Everything is slightly more vivid. You are more articulate than usual, more curious, more attuned to the other person's responses. You say things and then hear yourself saying them and think, where did that come from? You tell stories from your past with a narrative clarity and emotional resonance that those same stories told to a less significant audience have never carried. You are performing, but the performance is drawing from something real. It is selecting from the full range of who you are and presenting the most luminous aspects of that range. And the effect is a version of you that is genuinely you, but turned up, sharpened, arranged. The person watching this performance falls, not for you in your complete reality, but for this heightened, edited, arranged version. This is not their failure of perception. You offered them this version deliberately, if unconsciously. You led with it. You sustained it across weeks and months, often at considerable effort, and sometimes at the cost of needs and aspects of yourself that were quietly shelved because they did not fit the narrative you were constructing. And they fell, hard perhaps, completely perhaps, for the performance. What happens then? What happens when the performance begins to relax? When the effort of sustaining the heightened version becomes unsustainable? When the shelved selves begin pressing back toward the surface? Is one of the central human dramas of intimate relationships. And almost no one understands it clearly enough to navigate it well. You have probably experienced the moment when someone you thought you knew became, subtly, and then, less subtly, a stranger. The specifics vary, but the shape of it is consistent. You are some months into a relationship that began with extraordinary intensity and that feeling of rare, electric, irreplaceable connection, and something has shifted. The person in front of you is still the person you chose, still carries the qualities that drew you, but other qualities have appeared, qualities that were not in the early chapters. needs that seem inconsistent with who they presented themselves to be, reactions that feel sometimes like meeting someone entirely different inside a familiar face. You tell yourself they have changed. This is the story most people reach for because it preserves the belief that what you fell for was real, that the early version was true, and what has emerged since is a deviation from the truth. But consider the other possibility. The possibility that the person you fell for was the performance, and the person you are encountering now is the fuller reality, that they have not changed. They have simply stopped performing at the level the beginning required, that the mask has not slipped so much as it has been gently, inevitably set down, because no one can perform indefinitely at full intensity without cost. And here is the part that implicates you fully. While you were watching their mask begin to lower, your own was lowering too. The parts of you that were shelved in the early months were beginning to return. The patience was becoming less absolute. The endless availability was becoming, sometimes, unavailability. The fascinating, narratively coherent self was occasionally replaced by someone tired or irritable, or struggling with things that do not lend themselves to the kind of compelling presentation the early stage demanded. Two performances quietly concluding, two realities beginning to meet for the first time. Whether what they find in each other, the actual, unperforming, unedited selves, can sustain something real is the question that determines everything that follows. And the answer has almost nothing to do with compatibility as it was felt in the beginning. It has to do with something much harder and rarer, the willingness to be seen without the arrangement, without the edit, without the best self-performance that seduction requires. Here is where the psychological depth of this chapter demands something uncomfortable from you specifically. Think about the mask you wear when desire is present. Not the obvious social mask, everyone has that, but the more specific, more intimate one. The one that activates in the presence of someone you want to impress, to attract, to keep. What does that version of you emphasize? What does it suppress? What needs disappear from view? What parts of your history are presented, and which are quietly withheld? Not because they are shameful, but because they are complicated, or contradictory, or might generate responses you are not yet ready to receive. And what does it cost you? Over the course of your life, across the relationships you have moved through, to have been loved primarily for the arranged version, to have received affection and admiration directed at the performance, while the less curated parts of you sat in the wings, waiting to be invited on stage. There is a specific loneliness in being loved for your best self. It is quieter than the loneliness of not being loved at all, and it is in some ways more insidious, because it is surrounded by the evidence of connection while still carrying, underneath, the weight of the parts that were never offered and therefore never received. This is the real cost of the seductive persona. Not that it deceives others, but that it deprives you, systematically over time, of the experience of being known and chosen in your unperformed reality. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask the ego presents to the world, the socially adapted self constructed to function in the presence of others. He understood that the persona is not false. It is a necessary interface between the interior self and the external world. The problem arises not in having a persona, but in identifying with it so completely that the deeper self, what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything that has been excluded from the curated presentation, becomes inaccessible even to its owner. The person who has spent years performing their most desirable self in intimate relationships may eventually find, in a quiet and somewhat terrifying moment of honesty, that they are no longer entirely sure who is behind the performance. That the mask has been worn for so long, and with such consistency that removing it does not reveal a face but another mask, and beneath that, perhaps another. This is not a horror story about identity dissolution. It is a description of what happens when the performing self is never given permission to rest. When the question, "Who am I when no one I want to impress is watching?" goes unasked for long enough that the answer becomes genuinely uncertain. The performance is not the enemy. The performance is human. It is the bridge between your interior world and the external one. And some management of presentation is not only inevitable, but necessary for functioning in a social reality. But there is a difference between a bridge and a wall. The persona that allows you to connect, that presents a real but curated version of yourself, as an invitation into relationship is a bridge. The persona that prevents you from ever being fully known. Because the fear of being known and found insufficient is too great, too old, too deeply embedded to risk. That is a wall with the aesthetic of a door. And the relationships built at that wall, the ones where two performances met and fell for each other and called it love, those relationships carry always the weight of what was never said, the exhaustion of the sustained edit, the quiet grief of the parts that were present in the room but never in the conversation. Which self is real? All of them. That is the answer, and none of them alone. The luminous, performing, heightened self that showed up in the beginning was you. The tired, complicated, unmanaged self that surfaced later was also you. The self that exists in the dark, in the quiet, when the audience is gone and the performance is over. That self is perhaps the most you of all, and the one least often offered to the people who claim to know you best. The deepest intimacy is not falling in love with someone's best version. It is choosing someone's whole version, and being chosen wholly in return. That exchange is not produced by seduction. It cannot be manufactured by any of the 7 levers. It cannot be performed into existence. It requires something much simpler and much harder than any of that. It requires the mask to come down, completely, without the guarantee of what will be found acceptable on the other side. Most people are not willing to do this, not because they are cowards, because no one ever showed them it was survivable. Chapter 7. What you were really looking for. You were never looking for them. You were looking for something that predates them by decades. Something that existed as a shape. A specific, unnamed, achingly familiar shape. Long before they walked into the room and fit it so perfectly that you called it fate. You were looking for the resolution of something unfinished. The answer to a question you learned to carry before you were old enough to articulate the question itself. They were not the destination. They were the closest available map to somewhere you had been trying to get back to, or escape from your entire life. This is the chapter that goes somewhere most books about desire refuse to go. Not because the territory is unknown, but because it is too close, too personal. Too implicated in stories you have told yourself about who you are, and why you love the way you love, and why certain people have always, without exception, found their way through every defense you have ever built. The answer lives in the place you least want to look. There is a version of your romantic history that you have probably assembled into something coherent, a narrative with a through line. Perhaps it is a story of growth, of early mistakes and gradual learning, of becoming wiser, more selective, more self-aware with each relationship. Perhaps it is a story of bad luck, wrong people, wrong timing, circumstances that conspired against otherwise promising connections. Perhaps it is a story that places the difficulty squarely outside of you. They were unavailable or inconsistent, or ultimately unwilling to meet you where you needed to be met. These narratives are not entirely false, but they are incomplete in a specific and important way. They focus on the other person, on what they did or failed to do, on who they were or turned out to be. And in doing so, they quietly, consistently exempt from examination the one constant across every relationship in your history. You, not as a failing, not as the source of everything that went wrong, but as the carrier of a pattern so familiar that you have stopped seeing it as a pattern and started seeing it as simply the way things are, the type of person you are drawn to, the dynamics that feel natural to you, the particular flavor of emotional experience that shows up in some form regardless of who the other person is. Different faces, different names, different details, the same architecture. That architecture was not built by your adult choices. It was built much earlier, in a time before choice was even available to you, and it has been running your desire ever since. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and expanded by decades of subsequent research, describes how the early relational experiences of childhood create templates, not metaphorical templates, actual neural structures, patterns of expectation about how love will behave, how close people will treat you, how safe it is to need someone, how much of yourself you can reveal before the connection becomes threatened. These templates are formed before language. Before the prefrontal cortex that handles rational decision-making is remotely online. They are formed in the body, in the nervous system, through repeated experiences of reaching toward a caregiver, and finding warmth or finding absence, or finding something unpredictable enough that the child learns to manage the uncertainty as a condition of being alive and loved at the same time. And then those templates go underground, are covered over years by the accumulating sediment of personality and experience and conscious belief. You grow up, you become articulate, self-aware, emotionally intelligent in ways your younger self could not have been, and you carry beneath all of it the original instructions, the first lessons about what love looks, feels, and costs. And then desire arrives, and the template activates, and you call what follows chemistry. Think about the person, or the type, that has most reliably generated the particular intensity you have been unwilling to settle for in their absence. Not the one who was good for you, the one who was necessary to you, the one whose specific presence produced a feeling so particular and so powerful that every safer, steadier alternative felt, in comparison, like a reasonable facsimile of something that only they provided in the original form. Now think about the earliest version of that feeling. Not in a relationship, earlier, much earlier, the longing for approval that arrived unpredictably, the warmth that was extraordinary when it came and devastating when it didn't, the experience of loving someone who was sometimes fully present and sometimes entirely inaccessible, and learning, at a cellular level, that this is what love is. That it comes with this specific mixture of extraordinary closeness and bewildering distance, and that the distance is your problem to solve, and the closeness is the reward for solving it. Perhaps this is not your story exactly. Every childhood is different. Every family system creates its own specific emotional curriculum, but the structure beneath the specifics is remarkably consistent. We learn what love feels like from the people who first loved us. And we spend the rest of our lives, in relationship after relationship, unconsciously seeking out the emotional temperature of that original education. Not because we enjoyed the difficult parts, because the difficult parts are familiar, and familiarity to the nervous system registers as safety, even when it is anything but. Here is where it deepens into something that requires genuine stillness to receive. You did not only seek the feeling, you sought the resolution. Every pattern that was left unresolved in early life. Every time you reached and did not find warmth. Every time you were too much or not enough. Every time love arrived conditional on a version of yourself you had to perform to access it. Creates in the psyche not just a wound but a project. An unconscious imperative to return to the conditions of the original difficulty, and this time, get it right. This time, be enough. This time, make the unavailable person available. This time, earn the unconditional love that was available only conditionally. This is why you went back, not once, every time, to the person who made you work for it, to the dynamic that required you to be more, offer more, sustain more. Because buried beneath the conscious pain was the unconscious belief. If I can make this work, I will finally resolve something I have been carrying since before I had words for it. The tragedy is not that the project exists. The project makes complete psychological sense. The tragedy is that it cannot succeed, because the person you are trying to resolve the original wound through is not the person who created it. They cannot give you what you needed then, because they are not the one who withheld it. They are only the one who, by some precise and terrible coincidence of chemistry and timing and familiar emotional temperature, activated the template. You cannot heal a childhood wound through an adult relationship with someone who mirrors the person who created it. You can only repeat the original dynamic with increasing desperation and decreasing hope, until the pattern is seen clearly enough to be named. And naming it is the beginning of the only exit that actually exists. What were you really looking for in the relationships that consumed you? In the ones you stayed in past the point of reason? In the ones you cannot fully release even now? Even from this distance, even with everything you know about how they ended. Perhaps you were looking for proof that you are worth choosing, not abstractly, specifically, from someone whose approval felt scarce enough to be meaningful. Because the approval of someone who gives it freely has never quite satisfied the thing inside you that needs it most. The thing inside you learned early that easy warmth doesn't count. That only the warmth that had to be earned, that came after difficulty, after uncertainty, after the terrible suspension of not knowing, only that warmth registered as real. Perhaps you are looking for permission to exist as you are, not the edited, performing best self version, the full, complicated, unmanaged version. And you sought that permission specifically from people whose psychological makeup made them least able to grant it, because you were unconsciously recreating the conditions under which permission was originally withheld. Perhaps you were looking for home, not a physical place, a feeling. The specific emotional texture of something known and familiar, even if what was familiar was also painful. Because pain, when it is old enough, stops feeling like pain and starts feeling like belonging. None of this makes you weak. None of it makes you pathetic or broken or permanently lost to your own patterns. What it makes you is human, operating from neural templates, written before you had any say in what was written, seeking resolution for wounds that were not your fault to carry and are not your failure to have carried this far. But here is the truth. This chapter has been arriving at slowly, carefully from multiple angles because it needs to land without collapsing into something falsely comforting. Until you see what you have actually been looking for, you will keep looking in the same places. Different faces, same emotional architecture, different conversations, same unresolvable ache at the center. The pattern does not break by finding the right person. The pattern breaks by finding, with enough honesty and enough compassion for the younger version of yourself who needed something they didn't receive, what you have actually been seeking. And then, and this is the part no one tells you, grieving the fact that you needed it. That you needed it and did not get it in the form, and from the source that would have made the greatest difference. That grief is not weakness. It is not self-pity. It is the beginning of wanting something real instead of something familiar. And that shift, quiet, internal, requiring no audience, is the most significant movement in the entire territory this book has been mapping. Everything before this chapter was the architecture of desire from the outside. This is where the architecture inside you begins to become visible. And visible things, unlike invisible ones, can finally be chosen or released. Chapter 8. The moment you became the architect. There is someone somewhere who never fully recovered from you. Not from your cruelty. You were not cruel, or at least that is not how you think of it, and perhaps that framing is even accurate. But cruelty is not the only force that leaves a mark. Sometimes the deepest marks are left by ambiguity, by the almost, by the person who is warm enough to create attachment and unavailable enough to make that attachment permanently, exquisitely unresolved. That person may have been you, probably was you, at least once, possibly more times than you have been willing to count. This is the chapter you have been unconsciously bracing for since the beginning of this book, because every previous chapter, however uncomfortable, maintained a certain protective distance. It was about the forces acting on you, the patterns running through you, the wounds that shaped you. It was at its core still a story in which you were the one things happened. This chapter removes that protection entirely. You were not only a target, you were also, at various points in your relational history, the architect and the architecture you built, however unconsciously, however unintentionally, however firmly rooted in your own unresolved psychology, had consequences for real people who trusted you with their attention and sometimes their love. It is time to look at that directly. The comfortable identity most self-aware people construct around their romantic history goes something like this. I am someone who feels deeply, who has been hurt by people who could not match my emotional investment, who has struggled to find genuine connection in a landscape of unavailable or inconsistent partners. This narrative is not a lie. The hurt was real. The unavailability was real. The struggle was real. But notice what this narrative does not include. Notice whose perspective it is entirely told from. Notice the people who are absent from it, not the ones who hurt you, who are present in vivid and often painful detail, but the ones you may have hurt. The ones who reached toward you and found you suddenly, inexplicably cooler than you had been the week before. The ones who waited for a message that arrived 3 days late, with no explanation that matched the anxiety of the waiting. The ones who were given just enough warmth to stay invested, and just enough distance to remain perpetually uncertain. They are not in your story. They rarely are in anyone's story, because we are always the protagonist of our own narrative. And protagonists do not tend to occupy the role of the person who left someone else lying awake at 3 in the morning. constructing interpretations of a silence that was never going to resolve into the answer they needed. But you have been that person, and the silence was yours. Think about a specific time, and there is always one. When you held more power in a dynamic than the other person, and you knew it, and you used it, perhaps not consciously, perhaps not with anything recognizable as intention, but you felt the asymmetry. You felt the weight of their wanting pressing against you, and you made choices about availability, about disclosure, about the temperature of your attention that were shaped, at least in part, by the knowledge that you could. The flakiness that was not really about being busy. The response that came just late enough to remind them that your time was not guaranteed. The moment of extraordinary warmth offered after a period of inexplicable distance, and the way you registered somewhere beneath the performance of normalcy. That the warmth landed with a force it would not have carried if the distance had not preceded it. You knew what you were doing. Not in the front of your mind, perhaps. Not in the part of you that would have been horrified by the clinical description, but in the older, more instinctive part. The part that learned, long before conscious thought was available, how to manage closeness and distance in ways that preserved your sense of safety, while keeping the other person's desire sufficiently activated to remain available when you needed it. You were running the livers without reading the manual, without knowing their name. Here is what makes this genuinely complicated, and what prevents this chapter from being simply an exercise in guilt. You were not, in most cases, doing this from a position of surplus. You were not a person overflowing with security and confidence, deploying distance from a place of casual power. Poor Ding. You were doing it from a place of fear. The inconsistency that kept someone else uncertain was almost always the external expression of your own internal uncertainty. The withdrawal that felt to the other person like a strategic move was, from your side, often a genuine retreat. A pulling back that happened because closeness felt dangerous, because vulnerability had cost you remembered pain, because something in the dynamic triggered an old alarm that said, "Too close, pull back. This is how you get hurt." Your architecture was not built for their suffering. It was built for your survival. But survival architecture and deliberate manipulation produce, in the person on the receiving end, an experience that is functionally identical. They cannot see your fear. They can only feel your distance. And your distance, regardless of its origin, activates in them the exact cycle described in the previous chapter. The reach and withdraw, the uncertainty that becomes obsession, the intermittent reinforcements that bonds more deeply than consistent warmth ever could. You hurt people. This is not a condemnation. It is one of the most universal human experiences that exists, but it is one that almost no one names clearly, because naming it requires holding two things simultaneously that our psychology strongly prefers to keep separate. I was hurt and I hurt others, not in sequence, in parallel. Often with the same unexamined behaviors, often with people who are guilty of nothing more than wanting you at a moment when being wanted felt too exposed to survive. Let's be more specific, because specificity is where the real confrontation lives. There is a particular move that people who are emotionally guarded make so consistently and so automatically that they have stopped registering it as a move at all. It is the half-reveal, the strategic vulnerability, the disclosure of something personal. Something that feels like intimacy, that performs the function of intimacy, that creates in the other person a sense of being trusted with something rare, that is in fact carefully selected, intimate enough to generate closeness. Not so intimate as to create genuine exposure. You have done this. The story from your past that you tell when you want someone to feel close to you. Not the story that actually frightens you, but the adjacent one. The one that sounds vulnerable but has been told enough times to feel safe. The one that invites them toward you without actually opening the door. And they leaned in. Of course they did. Because it looked like openness. It felt like being trusted, and the warmth they felt toward you in that moment. The protective, tender, you can trust me warmth that was entirely genuine on their side. It was the response to a stimulus that was on your side, managed. You were not lying, but you were curating. And the curation served a purpose. It kept them moving toward you without requiring you to actually be reachable. There is another move. Quieter, harder to name because it happens in the absence of action rather than through it. The silence that communicated more than words would have. The withdrawal of engagement that said, without saying you are less certain of me than you thought. The moment when you became suddenly less responsive, not because anything had changed, but because something in the dynamic had felt too close to a commitment you were not ready to make. And the unconscious system that manages your emotional exposure defaulted to its oldest tool: distance. As protection, offered without explanation, received as a message. They read that silence with everything they had. They analyzed the sudden coolness. They asked themselves what they had done, what had shifted, what they needed to offer or adjust or withhold to return to the warmth that had been present before. They worked, in other words, exactly as hard as anyone works when the variable reward schedule activates and the reward becomes suddenly uncertain. You were not trying to activate that response, but you knew on some level that it would come. Because it always does. Because humans reach toward warmth and finding it withdrawn, reach harder. This is not a strategy you invented. It is one you absorbed, from the dynamics that shaped you, from the people who managed your attachment in exactly this way and called it, at the time, something else. You learned from masters, and you became, without a certificate or a conscious curriculum, one yourself. What do you do with this recognition? Not guilt. Guilt is useless here. It is a feeling that generates the sensation of accountability without requiring any of the actual work that accountability demands. Guilt allows you to feel bad and remain unchanged, which is perhaps the most comfortable version of self-confrontation available. What this recognition actually asks of you is something more demanding and more valuable than guilt. It asks for honesty about the impact your patterns have had on people who did not know they were entering a dynamic shaped by your unresolved history. It asks for the willingness to see yourself as a causal force in other people's pain, even when your own pain was the root cause of the behavior that produced. It asks for the specific and difficult compassion of holding your own woundedness and your own impact at the same time, without allowing one to erase the other. You were hurt. You hurt others. Both are true. Neither cancels the other. And somewhere in the territory between those two truths, in the uncomfortable, unresolved, genuinely complex space they create, is the beginning of something different. Not perfect, not clean, but different. The architect who sees the blueprint for the first time cannot unsee it. And the question that follows, the one this recognition opens rather than closes, is not whether you have built things that have caused harm. It is whether, now that you can see how you build, you are willing to learn to build differently. That answer is yours alone, but it begins with staying in this chapter long enough to feel its full weight. Don't look away yet. Chapter 9. When seduction becomes control. The dark edge. They didn't change, they revealed. This is the sentence that most survivors of coercive relationships eventually arrive at. Sometimes years later, sometimes in a single devastating moment of clarity, and it reorganizes everything. Every memory, every explanation, every story they told themselves and others about how someone who once felt like the most extraordinary person they had ever encountered became, over time, someone they were afraid of, or someone they could not leave even when every rational faculty they possessed was telling them to, or someone who made them, gradually and then completely, a stranger to themselves. They didn't change. The mask simply completed its function. The early version, the warmth, the attunement, the feeling of being seen so precisely it felt like fate, was not the person, it was the recruitment. And what followed was what the recruitment was for. This is not a chapter about monsters. Monsters are easy. You recognize them immediately, and you leave, and the story is uncomplicated. This chapter is about something far more difficult to name and far more dangerous to encounter. People who are entirely ordinary in every other domain of their lives, who experience genuine human feeling, who are not conscious architects of harm, and who nonetheless run with devastating consistency and effectiveness. A systematic campaign to make another person's sense of reality, self-worth, and independent agency contingent on them. This happens more often than you want to believe. It may have already happened to you, and the reason it is so difficult to see while it is happening. The reason intelligent, perceptive, emotionally sophisticated people find themselves deep inside these dynamics without understanding how they arrive there is the subject of this chapter. There is a belief that protects people from examining this territory too closely. I would know. It surfaces whenever the conversation turns toward coercive control or psychological manipulation in intimate relationship. It is offered as a shield, the certainty that recognition would arrive early enough to matter, that the signals would be clear enough to read, that whatever failure of perception allowed this to happen to someone else would not apply to you. This belief is not only wrong, it is, in a particular and painful irony, one of the qualities that makes highly capable people more vulnerable, not less. Because confidence in your own perception reduces the frequency with which you question it. And the most effective psychological manipulation in intimate relationships operates precisely in the space between what is happening and what the targeted person is willing to believe is happening. You have to be willing to believe something is wrong before you can see evidence that confirms it. And the architecture of these dynamics is specifically designed, again, often without conscious design, to make that willingness feel like a betrayal of the relationship, of the person, of the love you believed was real and that may, in some complicated and partial sense, have been. Every coercive dynamic begins in the same register as every ordinary one, with the 7 levers, with mystery, scarcity, mirroring, manufactured intimacy, idealization. In the early weeks, the experience of being with someone who will later deploy control is frequently described in identical terms to the experience of being with someone who won't. The attunement is exquisite. The mirroring is precise. The feeling of being found, of finally, after however many years of searching, being genuinely and completely seen, is real. The nervous system does not distinguish. The brain cannot tell. The body responds to the warmth as warmth, to the closeness as closeness, to the promise of finally being known as the most significant thing that has happened in years. This is not stupidity. This is not failure of perception. This is the seductive apparatus doing exactly what it does. In the same way, with the same neurological mechanisms, producing the same phenomenology of experience, regardless of the intentions driving it. The difference between a dynamic that remains within the range of ordinary human complexity and one that crosses into coercion is not visible in the beginning. It becomes visible in what happens when you establish yourself as a person with needs, opinions, or perspectives that diverge from the other person's preferred version of you. In ordinary dynamics, even difficult, imperfect, sometimes painful ones, divergence is absorbed, negotiated, tolerated as the inevitable expression of 2 separate people occupying a shared space. The other person remains recognizable across disagreement. They have a self that exists independently of their relationship with you and does not require your complete alignment to remain intact. In coercive dynamics, divergence is not tolerated. It is corrected. The correction is rarely direct. This is the crucial thing to understand. The detail that makes these dynamics so difficult to name in real time. The correction is delivered through a sophisticated and often unconscious system of social pressure that operates just below the threshold of what the targeted person is willing to classify as abuse. A comment about the way you handled something, delivered not with anger, but with a particular quality of disappointment that activates, with surgical precision, your existing tendencies toward self-doubt. A retelling of a shared event in which your experience of what happened is gently, persistently revised until the other person's version becomes, through sheer repetition, the one that feels more real. A withdrawal of warmth that arrives without explanation and lifts only when your behavior returns to the preferred range. Teaching, through operant conditioning as effective as any laboratory schedule. Which version of yourself is safe and which is dangerous? None of these individual events is necessarily extraordinary. Each one, in isolation, could be explained away. The relationship is going through a difficult period. They are under stress. You are being too sensitive. You are interpreting neutral behavior through a filter of your own anxiety. This explanation is always available, always partially plausible, and always offered by the other person and eventually by you yourself. Before the pattern becomes undeniable. The pattern is the point, not any single event, but the cumulative directional architecture of events over time, all moving in the same direction, all producing the same result. A gradual narrowing of the targeted person's behavioral range, emotional expression, and ultimately their sense of who they are, until the self that existed before the relationship becomes increasingly inaccessible, and the relationship becomes the primary reality around which all other reality is organized. There is a phenomenon that researchers in coercive control call the frog in slowly heated water. The incremental nature of the escalation means that each individual shift feels manageable, even reasonable in isolation. The water is never suddenly boiling. It is always just slightly warmer than it was, and the frog, acclimatized to each increment, does not register the cumulative temperature until the capacity to leave has been significantly compromised. The compromising of the capacity to leave is not incidental, it is the function. It happens through isolation, gradual, rarely announced, often framed as the natural expression of coupledom, or the reasonable preference for each other's company over a social world that does not understand the relationship the way the partner does. It happens through the systematic erosion of the targeted person's confidence in their own judgment, through patterns of correction and revision that create, over time, a deep uncertainty about the reliability of their own perception. It happens through the creation of a specific kind of dependency, not the ordinary vulnerability of loving someone and being afraid of loss, but a dependency on the other person's interpretation of reality. Because one's own interpretation has been so thoroughly and so persistently undermined that it no longer feels trustworthy, and it happens through love. This is the part that is hardest to hold. The control is not delivered in the absence of love. It is delivered alongside it, often simultaneously with it, in a mixture so complete that the targeted person cannot separate the two. The warmth is real. The moments of extraordinary connection are real. The person doing harm is not, in most cases, a person who has never experienced genuine human feeling. They are a person whose unresolved psychology has produced a relational style that requires a specific form of control to manage their own terror of abandonment, engulfment, or whatever particular wound drives the architecture. Their damage is doing the damage. This does not make them safe, but it makes the dynamic comprehensible. And comprehensibility is not sympathy. It is the beginning of seeing clearly. How do you know in real time rather than retrospect? There are signals. They are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They are quiet, internal, and require a quality of honest attention to your own experience that these dynamics are specifically designed to undermine. Your opinions change in their presence, not because new information has arrived, but because you have learned through repeated experience the cost of holding an opinion they do not share. You notice yourself editing, not just for social grace, but for safety. You find yourself conducting internal assessments before speaking, calculating likely responses, adjusting your presentation in ways designed not to express yourself but to manage theirs. You feel in the presence of someone who claims to love you, a vigilance that love should not require. You lose track of what you actually think, your own preferences, about small things, about where to eat, what to watch, what to feel about a given situation. Become uncertain in a way they were not before. Because your preferences have been so consistently revised or dismissed or redirected, that the reliable access to your own interior experience has become disrupted, and you find yourself with increasing frequency in the position of explaining your emotional experience to a person who does not accept it, who offers, instead, an alternative account of what you must actually be feeling, what you actually meant, what actually happened, and whose alternative account, delivered with the confidence of someone who has never questioned their own perception, gradually becomes more real than your own. This chapter is called a field guide. Here is what a field guide actually offers. Not comfort, but recognition. The ability to identify what you are looking at before it has cost you everything. The recognition this chapter is asking of you is not comfortable. If you are reading this and something in you has gone very still, if something in the language of this chapter has landed in a way that feels less like reading and more like being described, then something in your actual life may be asking for your attention in a way you have not yet been able to fully give it. The stillness you feel is information. Do not explain it away. You are not too sensitive. You are not too demanding. You are not imagining the pattern. The pattern is real. Patterns are always real, even when every individual event within them has been successfully explained away. The explanation of each tree does not account for the direction of the forest. And the question of what to do with this recognition, that question belongs entirely to you, in your specific circumstances, with your specific resources and your specific reality. This chapter does not pretend to answer it, but it stands firmly on this ground. The first protection against a system designed to make you doubt your own perception is the restoration of trust in your own perception, not certainty. Not the arrogant confidence that insists it would always know, but the quieter, harder, more durable commitment to taking your own experience seriously, to noticing what you notice, to staying with discomfort long enough to let it tell you what it actually is, rather than what is more comfortable to believe. Clarity, in the context of these dynamics, is not a gift that arrives. It is a practice that is chosen, again and again, against the considerable current of a dynamic that benefits from your confusion. Choose it anyway. That choice, small, internal, requiring no audience, is where the exit always begins. Chapter 10. The Unmasking. Seeing someone and being seen without the architecture. You have never been more frightened than in the moments when someone was about to truly see you. Not the version you prepared. Not the edited, arranged, strategically vulnerable self you have learned to offer as intimacy's substitute. The actual you. Unperforming, unresolved, uncertain in ways you have not yet found language for. Carrying needs that embarrass you and fears that feel too old and too deep to be reasonable in an adult life. That version, the one that exists in the privacy of 3 in the morning, when the constructions you maintain for the world have gone quiet and there is nothing left but what is actually there. The moment someone moves toward that version, really moves toward it, with the specific quality of attention that says, I see past the performance and I am still here. Something in you does not open. Something in you panics. This is not a flaw. This is the accumulated wisdom of every time you offered yourself without the armor and discovered, through the quality of what was returned, that the armor was necessary. Your fear of being truly seen is not irrational. It is a perfectly calibrated response to a history that taught you, in whatever specific way your history taught it, that the unperforming self is the self that gets left. But here is the thing this chapter needs to say before anything else. The protection that kept you safe has also kept you alone. Not lonely in the simple sense, alone in a more fundamental way, sealed inside the performance, occasionally pressing your hands against the glass and watching connection happen on the other side of it, wondering why. For all the intimacy you have experienced, something essential has never quite been reached. This chapter is about what is on the other side of the glass and what it costs to get there. Most people have never experienced genuine intimacy. This is not a judgment. It is a description of something structural. A feature of how human beings learn to manage connection in a world that repeatedly demonstrates the risks of complete openness. What passes for intimacy in the majority of relationships, even long, significant, deeply felt relationships, is a sophisticated and mutually maintained arrangement of selected disclosures and managed presentations. Two people who have chosen each other, who have built lives and histories together, who know each other's preferences and habits and surface-level vulnerabilities, who would describe each other as their closest person, and who have, despite all of this, never fully arrived in the same room as each other. Because the parts of themselves that would need to arrive are the parts that have never been off, that were decided somewhere along the way to be too much or too confusing or too likely to destabilize a connection that felt worth protecting through strategic concealment. This is not cynicism. Relationships built on selected disclosure can be warm, functional, sustaining. They can last decades. They can contain genuine love. They can be, by almost any external measure, successful. But there is a quality of knowing, a specific depth of being known, that they cannot reach. And people in these arrangements often sense its absence as a vague, unnameable dissatisfaction. A feeling that something is missing that they cannot quite identify, because the relationship contains everything they thought they wanted and still does not fully answer the hunger. The hunger is not for more of what the relationship contains. It is for something qualitatively different. Something that requires a different kind of exposure than anything yet offered or received. What remains when you strip away the performance? When the mirroring stops, when the mystery is set aside, when the 7 levers are disengaged, and 2 people sit with each other without the architecture. What is actually there? This question is more terrifying than it sounds, because the honest answer, for most people, contains a significant amount of uncertainty. The performance has been running for so long, and the managed version of self has been presented so consistently, that the question of what lies beneath it is not entirely answerable in advance. You have to take the mask off, and taking the mask off requires trusting that what you find there, and what the other person finds, witnessing the finding, will be survivable. That trust is extraordinarily difficult to locate, particularly if the history that taught you about intimacy also taught you that the unmasked self is the self that gets corrected, revised, managed, loved conditionally on remaining within a particular acceptable range. So people negotiate, they offer pieces. They go further than they have gone before, and then, at a certain depth, they stop. Not consciously, but through the smooth operation of a protective system that has been perfected over years of knowing exactly where the threshold is, the point just before full exposure, where there is enough intimacy to feel connected and enough concealment to feel safe. This threshold is different for everyone, but almost everyone has one, and the relationship almost always stops deepening at the point where one person's threshold is reached, and neither party has the tools or the courage to move through it. Here is what actual intimacy requires, stated plainly, and without the consoling softening it usually receives. It requires you to become visible in ways that cannot be controlled. To offer the parts of yourself that have no strategic value, that do not make you more attractive or more interesting or more desirable, but are simply uncomplicatedly true. The anxiety that does not resolve into a compelling personal narrative. The need that feels too large and too old to be reasonable. The grief that has not yet become wisdom. The ordinary, unilluminating moments of being a human being that the performing self has learned to either elevate into something shareable or keep entirely private. It requires you to be witnessed in your actual dimensions, not the curated ones. And it requires you to witness another person in theirs, to resist the impulse, powerful, instinctive, deeply conditioned, to receive their unmasked self through the filter of your own needs and narratives, to actually see them, the specific, irreducible, sometimes inconvenient reality of who they are when they are not performing, including the parts that complicate your story about them, including the parts that are not beautiful or fascinating or particularly interesting. That the parts of you that have been waiting off stage, the unperforming, unresolved, genuinely vulnerable parts, deserve to be offered into connection, even without the guarantee of what they will receive in return. This decision cannot be forced. It cannot be reasoned into existence. It cannot be produced by reading a book, however carefully and however honestly the book has been engaged with. But it can be prepared for. And what this entire book has been preparing you for, through every layer of architecture it has named and exposed, is the recognition that the performance, however impressive, has a ceiling. That the desire it generates, however intense, does not finally satisfy. That the connection it produces, however real it feels, remains at a distance from the thing you are actually hungry for. And that the thing you are actually hungry for exists in the only territory that seduction, by its very nature, cannot reach. The unmasked space, where there is no architecture. No lever, no mirror. Just 2 people without their strategies, deciding whether what they actually find in each other is enough to stay for. That decision, unscripted, unguaranteed, requiring a quality of courage that the performing self cannot access, is the only doorway into anything that deserves the name love without qualification. The door has always been there. The only question is whether you are finally willing to stop performing long enough to walk through it. Chapter 11. Desire Reclaimed. Using awareness as power, not paralysis. There is a version of this knowledge that breaks people. They read what you have read. They see the architecture. They trace the levers operating in their history, map the patterns running through their relationships, recognize the withdrawal cycles and the mirror traps and the manufactured intimacies, and then something in them goes cold. The world, which once felt charged with the electricity of possibility, begins to feel like a chessboard. Every connection becomes suspect. Every feeling becomes a variable to be analyzed, rather than a reality to be inhabited. They become, in the name of clarity, entirely unable to feel. This is not awakening. This is a different kind of prison. And it is the trap that waits at the end of every psychological education that stops one chapter too soon. This chapter exists because stopping there, at pure deconstruction, at the forensic understanding of how desire operates, is not the destination. It is the most dangerous resting place available. Because a person who has lost access to their own feeling, in the name of protecting themselves from illusion, has not become free. They have become numb. And numbness, dressed in the language of self-awareness, is perhaps the most convincing story a wounded person can tell themselves about why they no longer fully show up for their own life. You did not read this book to become numb. You read it to become sovereign. These are not the same thing. And the difference between them is the entire subject of everything that follows. Here is the fear that this book may have quietly planted without intending to. That awareness destroys magic. That if you can see the mechanism, you can no longer experience the feeling. That knowledge and wonder are mutually exclusive. That understanding how a thing works removes the capacity to be moved by it. This fear is understandable, and it is wrong. Consider what happens when a musician understands music theory at a deep level. When they can hear a chord progression and name every component, trace the emotional architecture of a composition, and understand exactly which intervals produce which responses in the listener. Does this knowledge make the music less moving? Does the understanding of why something is beautiful eliminate the experience of its beauty? For the amateur, perhaps. For someone who has not yet integrated theory into instinct, who is still thinking about the notes instead of feeling the music, the knowledge can briefly interrupt the experience. But for the musician who has moved through that stage, who has allowed understanding to become embodied rather than merely intellectual, who has let the theory dissolve into the playing, the awareness deepens everything. They hear more, they feel more. They are moved not less, but differently, with a quality of recognition and depth that the person who only listens without understanding cannot access. This is what awaits you on the other side of this book if you allow it, not the cold distance of the analyst. The richer, more deliberate, more deeply felt experience of someone who understands the instrument they are playing and has therefore become capable of playing it with genuine intention rather than merely being played. Sovereign desire. This is the phrase this chapter has been building toward, and it requires unpacking before it can be inhabited. Sovereignty, in the context of desire, does not mean imperviousness. It does not mean the ability to be attracted to anyone you choose and indifferent to everyone else. It does not mean freedom from the pull of certain people, or the end of longing, or the elimination of the particular ache that comes with wanting something you do not yet have. Desire without vulnerability is not sovereignty. It is another word for emptiness. Sovereign desire means something more precise and more demanding than invulnerability. It means that you are the primary author of your relational choices, not the unconscious templates from childhood, not the intermittent reinforcement schedule of someone who activates your oldest wounds, not the manufactured urgency of scarcity, or the intoxication of mystery, or the dazzling precision of a mirror showing you exactly who you most need to believe you are. Those forces still exist. They will still activate. You will still feel the pull of certain people with an intensity that your analytical understanding cannot fully neutralize. And that is correct, because desire is not a problem to be solved, but a signal to be interpreted. The question is no longer whether the signal fires. The question is what you do in the space between the signal and the decision. That space, the gap between feeling and action, between the pull and the response, is where sovereignty lives. It is not a large space. Sometimes it is very small indeed, but it exists. It can be widened. And in that widening is the entirety of the difference between a life shaped by unconscious pattern repetition and a life shaped by deliberate, informed, genuinely chosen movement toward what you actually want. What does this look like in practice? It looks like noticing. Before acting, before deciding, before committing to an interpretation of your own feeling, noticing. This person generates in me an intense response. Let me sit with that response long enough to ask what it is made of. Is this the electricity of genuine resonance, or the electricity of a familiar wound being reactivated? Is this attraction to who they actually are, or to what they represent? To the shape they fill in the template I have been carrying? Is this desire moving me towards something real, or moving me towards something I have pursued before and found empty at its resolution? These questions do not eliminate desire, they contextualize it. They give you information that the unexamined version of yourself, operating on pure instinct and old programming, was never able to access in real time, and they change the quality of what you choose. Not by making every choice the safe one, not by systematically selecting for stability at the expense of aliveness, but by ensuring that when you choose intensity, you are choosing it with your eyes open, aware of what it is made of, clear about what it is likely to cost, and willing to pay that cost as an informed adult rather than as someone being run by processes they have never examined. This is not a lesser passion. This is a more honest one. There is something else that awareness changes. Something that takes longer to arrive than the insights about manipulation and pattern and mechanism. Something quieter, warmer, and in some ways more significant than any of the more dramatic revelations this book has contained. Awareness changes what you find attractive. Not completely, not overnight, and not in ways that can be forced or decided in advance, but genuinely, over time, as the patterns become visible and the old templates lose their automatic authority. The type of person who generates the most intense response in you begins to shift, not towards someone safe in the deadening sense, towards someone real. Someone whose depth is actual rather than performed. Someone whose availability is genuine rather than strategic. Someone whose warmth arrives without the withdrawal cycle attached, and who, despite the absence of the manufactured urgency that once felt like passion, generates in you something steadier and ultimately more sustaining. This person may not ignite the same immediate, vertigo-inducing electricity that the old pattern did, and this will, for a time, feel like a problem. Your nervous system, calibrated to the intensity of the old architecture, may initially register this person's groundedness as ordinariness, their consistency as predictability, their genuine availability as somehow less compelling than the strategic unavailability you have been trained to read as value. This is the recalibration. It is uncomfortable. It asks you to sit with a lower immediate voltage and trust that what you are feeling is not the absence of passion, but the presence of something that will grow rather than collapse. Something built on actual substance rather than on the exquisite tension of never quite being certain. Very few people have the patience for this recalibration. Most, at some point, return to the familiar intensity, the known suffering, because it at least feels alive in a way the quieter thing hasn't learned to yet. But the people who stay in the recalibration long enough discover something that cannot be described to anyone who has not experienced it, a desire that does not exhaust you, that moves toward rather than circling endlessly around, that exists in the same room as peace without canceling it. You are not the same person who opened this book. Not because you have been given new beliefs to adopt, but because you have been shown a map that you cannot unsee. The architecture of desire, its mechanisms, its patterns, its extraordinary capacity to masquerade as fate while running on a completely legible psychological operating system, is now visible to you in a way that changes the experience of everything it touches. What you do with that visibility is the only question that remains. You can use it as armor. Become the person who sees too much to feel, who applies the framework defensively to every connection, who is so busy identifying the levers that they never allow themselves to be moved. This path is available. It will protect you from certain kinds of pain. It will also seal you away from the thing you have been seeking since before you had words for seeking it. Or you can use it as orientation, as the compass that helps you move through the territory of desire, more honestly, more awake, more chosen, more fully present to what is actually happening, rather than to the story your unexamined patterns have been generating on autopilot. The difference between these two paths is not visible from the outside. It lives entirely in the quality of your internal experience, in whether you show up to connection as a closed system or an open one, in whether knowledge becomes the wall or the window. Desire is not the enemy of clarity. Passion is not the enemy of awareness. The fire does not go out when you understand how fire works. It burns differently. more deliberately, with less of the frantic, consuming quality that comes from burning without knowing why, and more of the steady, directed quality that comes from choosing what to set alight and what to let cool. That is sovereign desire, not passion extinguished. Passion finally in the hands of the person it belongs to, you, for perhaps the first time. The question is not whether you are ready for it. The question is whether you are willing to stop mistaking the old intensity for the real thing, long enough to discover what the real thing actually feels like when it is chosen rather than fallen into. It feels quieter than you expected, and it burns longer than anything you have known. Chapter 12. The Awakened Seducer. Living fully in the reality you now see. You cannot go back. This is not a warning. It is simply the truth about what has happened to you across the course of this book, stated plainly before anything else is said. The person who opened the first page and encountered the first uncomfortable suggestion. That desire is not something that happens to you, but something that is built, layer by careful layer, inside the theater of your own mind. That person no longer exists in the form they existed then. Something has been seen that cannot be unseen. Something has shifted in the architecture of how you understand yourself in relation to other people. And that shift, however quiet it may feel in this moment, is permanent. This should be slightly terrifying. Not because what you have learned is dark, though parts of it are, but because there is a particular grief that accompanies the end of useful illusion. The world that operated by mystery, by the feeling that desire was fate and chemistry was magic, and the people who consumed you did so because of something irreducibly real between you. That world is more complicated now, more legible, and legibility, for all its value, carries a cost that sentimentality about knowledge tends to obscure. You will miss sometimes, not knowing what you now know. That is the first thing the awakened person must make peace with, not as a wound, as a trade. What you have exchanged the old innocence for is something more valuable, though harder to feel as such in the early stages of the exchange. You have traded the comfort of not seeing for the power of seeing clearly. And that power, as this chapter will demonstrate, is not what you might expect it to be. Most people, arriving at a moment of psychological transformation, expect to feel different immediately, lighter, more certain, freed, in some palpable and obvious way, from the patterns that the new understanding has revealed. They expect that seeing the cycle clearly will interrupt it automatically, that knowledge and liberation are the same event, separated only by the moment of recognition. They are not. And the discovery of this, the recognition that you can understand a pattern completely and still feel its pull with almost the same force as before, is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a self-aware person. You watch yourself being drawn toward the familiar architecture. You name the lever as it activates. You identify the template, recognize the echo of the original wound, observe the manufactured scarcity generating its reliable urgency, and you feel it anyway. Perhaps slightly differently. Perhaps with a new quality of witnessing layered over the feeling. But you feel it. The pull is still there. The warmth still lands. The withdrawal still creates the hollow it was always designed to create. And you wonder, in that moment, whether any of this has made any difference at all. It has. But the difference is not where you were looking for it. The change that psychological awareness produces is not the elimination of feeling. It is the insertion of authorship into the space between feeling and action. A space that did not previously exist, or existed so briefly that it could not be inhabited. The old self moved from stimulus to response with the smooth, uninterrupted flow of someone who does not know they are being moved. The feeling arrived and the behavior followed, linked by the invisible chain of unconscious pattern. And the person in between called it choice because it felt like choice from the inside, and they had no framework for seeing the machinery. You now have the framework, and the framework creates the pause, fractional at first, longer over time, as the practice of inhabiting it becomes more natural. And in that pause, in that small, growing, extraordinary space between the pull and the response, something becomes possible that was not possible before. Not the right decision automatically. Not the absence of the old mistakes guaranteed, but a genuine encounter with the question, what do I actually want here, as opposed to what the pattern wants? That question is new. It may be the most important question you have ever been able to ask in real time. And the ability to ask it, in the room, in the moment, with the pull still present and the old response still available, is the entire difference between a life shaped by repetition and a life shaped by choice. The awakened seducer. This phrase requires examination because it contains a paradox that the previous chapters have been building toward, and that this final one must resolve. Seducer sounds, in the context of everything this book has named, like the wrong word for someone who has seen the architecture clearly. It sounds like the person who runs the levers, who manages the mirrors, who deploys the mechanisms of desire with sophisticated understanding of their effects. And in the framework of the earlier chapters, where seduction was examined as a system of manufactured influence, this reading would make the phrase sinister. But seduction has another meaning, the older one, the one that precedes the clinical deconstruction and survives it. In its root, the Latin seducer, seduction means to lead aside, to draw away from the ordinary path, to move someone through your presence and your attention and the quality of your engagement with them, towards something they would not have reached alone. In this sense, every person who has ever made another person feel genuinely seen, who has offered real attention rather than strategic attention, real interest rather than manufactured interest, real warmth rather than calculated warmth, has been a seducer, has led someone, for a moment or for a lifetime. The awakened seducer is the person who understands the architecture so completely that they no longer need it, who can generate genuine draw, not through the withdrawal cycle, or the manufactured scarcity, or the precisely calibrated mirroring, but through the far more demanding and far more powerful practice of actual presence. Actual presence. Being in the room with another person without an agenda, without the managing of impression, without the selection of which self to offer, based on what is most likely to produce the desired response, showing up fully with the complexity and the contradiction and the unresolved edges that make a person real, and allowing that showing up to be the entirety of the offer. This is more frightening than any of the architecture this book has described, because it has no guaranteed outcome. The levers, when correctly deployed, produce predictable results. Presence produces nothing predictable. It is a genuine encounter with another consciousness, and genuine encounters are ungovernable. They cannot be managed into safety. But they are the only source of the thing you have actually been seeking throughout every relationship this book has caused you to reconsider. Not the feeling of connection. Connection itself. Here is what living in the reality you now see actually looks like. Not in the abstract. In the daily, ordinary, unsexy texture of an awakened relational life. It looks like meeting someone who activates every lever in your historical pattern. The mystery, the scarcity signal, the precise mirroring of your deepest self-image, and feeling the pull fully while simultaneously asking, without drama and without self-congratulation, is this genuine or is this architecture? And then staying with the question long enough to gather real information, rather than letting the urgency of the feeling collapse the inquiry before it can yield anything useful. It looks like noticing when you are performing. When the edited, strategic, heightened version of yourself has taken the stage without your conscious permission, and making a small, quiet choice to offer something slightly more real, not explosively, not as a dramatic gesture of vulnerability, just a fractional movement toward honesty, one less curated sentence, one moment of admitting uncertainty instead of projecting confidence. Small increments of actual presence offered as practice rather than performance. It looks like choosing people differently, not perfectly. Not with the elimination of attraction to complicated, unavailable, historically familiar types. That recalibration takes longer than a book, longer than a year, longer sometimes than a decade of honest effort, but with a growing ability to distinguish between the intensity of genuine resonance and the intensity of a wound being reactivated. To feel both and to know they are not the same thing, and to make choices that serve the former rather than the compulsively seeking the latter. It looks like the willingness to stay in a connection that does not have the vertiginous, consuming, all or nothing quality of the old architecture. To sit with something steadier and quieter and more spacious, and to trust, against the conditioning of every high-voltage relationship that preceded it, that what is being offered is not lesser but deeper, not less feeling but more of the feeling that actually nourishes, rather than the feeling that burns everything it touches. There is one final thing this chapter needs to say. One thing that every previous chapter has approached and circled without fully landing. The awareness you carry now is not a burden, although it will sometimes feel like one. It is not a wall between you and experience, although you will sometimes mistake it for one. It is not the end of desire, the death of passion, or the transformation of your relational life into a series of analytical exercises conducted at a careful distance from your own feeling. It is, when it is working as it is meant to work, a kind of grace. The grace of moving through the most charged and consequential territory of human experience. Desire, attachment, love, loss, the ancient hunger for genuine connection, with enough clarity to make real choices. With enough self-knowledge to distinguish what you actually want from what the pattern has always wanted on your behalf. With enough compassion for yourself and for others to hold the full complexity of what it means to be a human being trying to love and be loved in a world that rarely teaches any of us how. This is what you have now. Not perfection, not immunity, not the end of difficulty or confusion, or the occasional devastating pull towards someone who is architecturally perfect for your wound and genuinely wrong for your life. But something real and earned and yours. A quality of wakefulness in the territory of desire that most people never develop. Not because they are incapable, but because they never stopped long enough, in enough honesty, to look at what was actually running their choices. You stopped. You looked. The question that remains, the one this book closes on, not because it is answerable, but because it is the right one to carry forward, is this. Now that you can see the difference between what was manufactured and what is real, between what the pattern wants and what you want, between the performance of connection and connection itself, what will you build? Not with the levers, not with the architecture, not with the tools this book has named and exposed and handed back to you with full knowledge of their function, with your actual self, unperforming, unstrategic, genuinely, dangerously, irreversibly present. What will you build with that? The answer to that question is not in this book. It never was. This book was only ever the clearing, the necessary demolition of the structures that were built in the dark before you knew what you were building or why. What comes after the clearing is yours entirely. And it begins. It has already begun. The moment you close this page and carry the clarity back into the world that is waiting, as it always has been, for you to show up in it without the mask. That world is more interesting than the one you inhabited before. More demanding, more alive. You are ready for it, whether you feel ready or not. You are not the same person who read the first page. Something shifted, maybe quietly, maybe violently, somewhere in these chapters. A memory surfaced that you've been avoiding. A pattern clicked into place. A relationship looked suddenly, uncomfortably different in the light of what you now understand. That discomfort, that is not damage. That is the price of clarity. Here is the truth. This book has been circling from the beginning. Most people will go their entire lives being moved by forces they never examine. They will fall into desire like falling into water, breathless, disoriented, certain that drowning feels like flying. They will call it fate. They will call it love. They will call it connection. And some of it will be real, and some of it will be architecture, and they will never know the difference. You now have a choice they don't have. You can see the machinery. You can recognize the patterns in real time. You can ask the question that changes everything. Is this genuine or is this engineered? And if it's engineered, who is the architect? Those who ignore what you've learned here will keep repeating the same cycles. Different faces, same dynamics. Different names, same wounds. The loop does not break itself. But for those who wake up, truly wake up, something remarkable becomes possible. Desire without desperation. Attraction without addiction. Connection that is chosen, not just fallen into. That is not a lesser life. That is a larger one. This is not the end of the journey. It is the point where the real one begins. If this book opened something in you, follow where it leads. There is more to explore, more patterns to examine, more psychology to unpack, more layers beneath the layers. Share this with someone who is stuck in a cycle they can't name. Leave a thought in the comments. Not because engagement metrics matter, but because the conversation that follows is part of the awakening. What you recognized in these pages deserves to be spoken out loud. The most dangerous thing you can do now is close this book and go back to sleep. The ones who understand desire are never again entirely at its mercy.